I just wanted to take a minute and welcome everyone to our research seminar. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Rachel Warner. I'm the Executive Director of LDI. And we're really excited to have today's research seminars with Dr. Ann Sales. Thank you for joining us today. Typically, as many of you know, hosting these research seminars is a big part of what LDI does, but they have been on hiatus for the last year due to a lot of competing activities. And it's felt like a little bit of a hole in what we do. So we're really excited to return to doing research seminars today, and particularly excited to do so with Dr. Sales because she was scheduled to be with us almost a year ago in person. So we're very excited that you were patient with us and accepted our invitation to come back virtually. Today's seminar is being co-hosted with PICE at LDI, Penn's Implementation Science Center, which is directed by Renat Batis, who I will turn it over to in one moment to introduce Dr. Sales.
Thank you so much, Rachel. On behalf of PICE at LDI and myself and Megan Lane Fall, I'm so excited to introduce Dr. Ann Sales. She's a professor at the Department of Learning Health Sciences at the University of Michigan and a research scientist at the VA. She's also editor at Implementation Science Communications, one of our new implementation science journals. That's a spinoff from Implementation Science, fantastic journal. She is an international expert and true thought leader in implementation science. She has many papers and grants, and I could spend the whole hour talking about how accomplished she is. But I just want to note that in addition to her brilliance, she's incredibly generous and thoughtful. I've watched her ask questions over the years at conferences. I've watched her mentor others, and I've been lucky enough to interact with her. And she is a true inspiration and role model for us all. So with that, I want to turn it over to Dr. Sales. We're so lucky to have you here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Renat, and thank you, Rachel. I just want to say, I think actually the patience has been on your part. The reason I wasn't able to come a year ago was I broke my leg that week. So fortunately, the nice thing about this winter is I haven't had to deal with ice because even though we've had it, I don't go outside when it's icy. So it's been great. Okay, so without further ado, I'm just going to go ahead and share my slides and get started because I am really looking forward to discussion and conversation. And so I want to be sure that there's plenty of time for that. Hopefully everyone can see my slides at this point. Great. And I think they're in slide mode now. So what I'm going to talk about today is kind of the intersection between implementation science and economics. I very specifically didn't say behavioral economics because I want to talk a little bit more broadly about economics more generally. And I'm really going to focus on theory, although I am going to try and use examples and bring in some of the application pieces of this as I'm talking. So I'm going to start off with some definitions because, in this field, language is turning into a real problem, at least in implementation science, maybe less so in behavioral economics. And we're using terms in many different ways without necessarily being all that clear about what we mean. So I want to try to start off with some clarity. And then I'm going to start talking much more about common theoretical bases and a couple of additional pieces from economic theory that I think could really benefit implementation science, possibly also behavioral economics, because I'm not sure at this point that what I'm going to talk about is all that incorporated into behavioral economics. And then I'd like to get to going forward. But I do want to start off by saying that what I'm going to talk about, and I think this is always true when we talk about theory, is kind of a caricature. And the caricature is probably more of behavioral economics than it is for implementation science. I know the implementation science literature better than I know the behavioral economics literature. And so my vision of behavioral economics probably is more of a cartoon in the sort of classic sense of sketch than the implementation science part. But I will continue to try to be balanced. I should also say as part of this disclaimer that the PhD program I did in health services research, now going back 25, 30 years, at the University of Minnesota was dominated by health economists. As many of you probably know, that program for many years had a lot of very prominent health economists in it. And so what they taught was very much health economics. And so my vision, view, understanding of economics comes from that experience. And what I'm going to sort of put on behavioral economics also comes from that experience. So very quickly, what I've got up on the screen right now is the prevalent definition of implementation science. It comes from the first editorial, the opening editorial for the journal Implementation Science, which I've been associated with now for many years. And the main point I want to make is there are a lot of words here. It's a bulky definition, and I would say it's not very precise. It's hard to make sense of these words, at least for me, to a clear understanding of what is the outcome of doing implementation research. And the biggest problem is it doesn't define implementation at all. And this is true of the implementation research literature in general, because I've actually been doing a lit search around this. And what I can find is a lot of definitions of implementation research, implementation science, very little definition of implementation, which strikes me as interesting and a little unfortunate. So the definition on the left here are the definitions I use. And I start with really thinking about what is implementation. And let me say that it's actually great to talk about this at Penn, because I know that this first bullet point is largely one I share with Renad and her colleagues at Penn in the implementation science world. So I define implementation as a process of planned human behavior change under organizational constraints. And that last phrase, under organizational constraints, is the piece that I think may differ a little bit between the definitions that Renat and her colleagues have been using, the definition that I give you here. I think it's important to really focus on a couple of important things: process, planned, behavior change, and then organizational constraints. And let me just say, when I say constraints, I don't always mean negative constraints in the sense of chains that bind you. Constraints can also be enablers, but organizational influence and setting that changes the way people behave. I should say very quickly, my world is generally provider facing. The work I do in implementation research faces providers in the health system, and I don't do work that it specifically faces patients or consumers. And I think that that's a big difference. Other people do work that's much more like that. So what follows from that definition is that implementation science is the study of implementation and related processes, which makes a much simpler definition, because you can simply say, this is what I think implementation is, and this is what I think the science of it is. And then I think it's important to say that in health, implementation science applies the study of implementation and the related processes to healthcare services, sometimes to health itself. And what I say here is possibly secondarily to health behavior. That actually I think is a different discipline, and I think of that as more health psychology and behavior change at the individual level, which I think is different. That's why that under organizational constraints is important in my mind. And then the last piece I think is important just to say, although I'm not going to talk about it today, is that implementation practice applies tools and information from implementation science to improving delivery of services. So that's a set of definitions I'm using. And I'll just say it's different. In this definition, the term behavior change does not happen. It isn't there. I think that's a critical piece here. And although this definition talks about influences and says something about organizational behavior, it's not clearly and succinctly associated with implementation. I also want to say that initial definition of implementation can apply to any sector and any process where humans behave, particularly in organizational settings, and there's a need for behavior change. It's not just health, education, social sciences, manufacturing, a wide range of places. Moving on to behavioral economics, I'm sure that there are places in textbooks where there's clear definition, but certainly when you sit down and do a web search, which I did, it's quite varied what comes up. And I think what's interesting to me, because this conforms to my understanding of what behavioral economics is and how it's being used and studied, is that you can see it as economic first, with psychology kind of a heavy second, or you can see it as primarily psychological, in the case of the Wikipedia definition, psychological, cognitive, emotional, cultural, and social factors on decisions of individuals, where the term economics doesn't really even come into the definition until you get to the end, and it says and how those decisions vary from those implied by classical economic theory, which I think is an interesting alternate approach. But I also took a look at a number of texts and books about behavioral economics. And in general, they start with stories. They don't start with definitions, which I found interesting. It actually, I think, in some ways is very consistent with the practice of behavioral economics. But from the perspective of someone searching for definition, it's not necessarily all that helpful. So then, thinking about the relationship between these two emerging fields of study, emerging disciplines, you could represent it with the sort of Venn diagram circles on the left, where they overlap, but also have significant stuff that's unique to each. Or you can think of it, as nested within. And I'm the one who decided to put the behavioral economics as a smaller nested piece inside a larger implementation science. I think you could reverse that. And I think there's even a question of, does it matter, that I will come back to. But I do want to say that I think that as both of these are applied to health, we have to ask the question, is health different from other goods and services? And is healthcare different from other sectors? And I'm going to argue that it is, not necessarily in the grandest scheme of things, because I know that in economics, there is an open debate, which I think is unsettled, about whether health is a normal good. And I really don't want to enter that debate, though I'm happy to talk about it. But I do think that, health is going to be different enough. So very quickly, for the rest of what I'm going to talk about, I'm thinking about this in the context of health and health services, mostly health services, because to be honest, I'm not sure I know what the definition of health is. Again, I know that there have been some very good pieces of work around this, but the work I do applies to health services and to the delivery of healthcare rather than necessarily health itself. So there, I think, are differences in the theory bases for these two. Implementation science is a synthetic discipline. And what I mean by that is it pulls and draws theory from everywhere else. Whether we have our own theory, I think, is a bit of an open question. There are some theories that are attributed to their genesis comes from implementation research itself. But by and large, we are pulling theory from other places. And those places include prominently at this point psychology. And I think about the theory of planned behavior, theory of reasoned action, control theory, and many other psychological theories that largely are around behavior change and typically around the behavior of individuals. Sociology has had some influence, I would say less than psychology at this point, in implementation science, particularly in the study of norms and norm development, normative functions. Social networks, social influence, and things that sort of cross over into social psychology to some extent as well. Issues around cognitive dissonance, which I think overlaps sociology and psychology, are quite important in implementation science. And then there's a whole range of organizational studies, organizational behavior, change management, or psychology, and many other things, engineering, their systems theory. And then I think we should recognize that there's also a lot of stuff that enters in that really is, in theory, at least atheoretical. Health services research, for example, prides itself on being atheoretic in many ways. And I think also medicine prides itself on atheoretical stances, despite the fact that much of medicine is actually, predicated on theories of sorry about the dogs barking in the background, theories of pathophysiology and other pathologies. So bottom line, implementation science, lots and lots of theoretical bases. Behavioral economics, I think the primary dominant theoretical bases come from economic theory. And again, this is my perspective, but utility theory overarches most of economic theory and is really a grounding foundational piece. And in particular, theories around rational choice. That has been somewhat overtaken or mitigated, changed a bit by prospect theory and by notions of the boundedness of rationality. And then there's a lot of other smaller theoretical bases that I think inform behavioral economics. But the utility theory, prospect theory, and the boundedness of rationality seem to me to be really core to the theoretic basis of behavioral economics. So very briefly, my guess is most of you are very familiar with utility theory, so I won't belabor this. It primarily explains observed behavior and choices, but focuses on expected utility. So an expectation that comes from the idea that humans have utility functions, and those utility functions include our observable preferences and the things we choose to consume. So primarily made up of consumption goods, but consumption goods can include certainly health services, possibly health, and other things that are more in the sort of cognitive or experiential range than necessarily observable. It also posits that these are preference ranked, and therefore, by knowing or getting to know someone's utility function, you can predict what their choices and therefore their behavior will be. Prospect theory deals with choices and how people make choices, but really factors in more about risk and uncertainty, and grounds it in the current reality that the person in themselves, again, we're talking about individuals here, the individual perceives them to be in. So for example, my health choices may be predicated on what I think my personal health state is, which is not observable easily by someone else because there are internal things going on that I'm aware of that may not be externally observable. And the interpretation I make of those things is not externally observable either. But that grounds me, anchors me in a particular place, and then the choices I make are coming out of that grounding. In conditions of risk, figuring out how likely it is that something will actually result if I take this step or use this kind of behavior, and uncertainty. It's risk is seldom 100%. There's a strong focus on loss aversion. And this is, I think, an important concept. And this, in many ways, I think this is a key insight that drives behavioral economics. The people are more anxious, causes more disutility, lack of utility, negative utility, to lose something that you have than the gain in utility for something you don't have, but might get if you make a particular choice. And that means that both uncertainty and the perception of risk mediate decisions that are made. And I just want to note that there may be some correlation with personality. And I have to be honest, there may be quite a lot of literature on that. I didn't really look for it, and it may be out there. I'll just note that personality is not something we study much in implementation science. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes as well. So prospect theory is an important extension and modification of utility theory. It doesn't throw it out, but it shifts it, I think, in very important ways. So it's no longer an ideal world where you're facing ideal conditions and that expected utility is the actual utility that people face. In fact, it says actual utility experienced utility is something different from expected utility. And that's a really important insight because it in part explains what seem to be irrational behaviors, irrational choices that people make. The anchoring to a reference point, the perception of current status is really important. And I think the lack of observability of many things, especially related to perceptions of health, is actually quite important. And then finally, I'll just say there are other important theoretical propositions and theories that are also associated or linked to prospect theory, including the idea of heuristics, biased thinking, how humans are actually not very good at thinking without bias, and then the notion of slow and fast thinking modes and satisficing. So all of those things have some relationship to each other, and I think can be kind of amalgamated into a broad notion of prospect theory. So how do these things factor into health and healthcare? And I think it's fair to say that, in the sort of pure utility theory, expected utility, traditional utility theory, there is an assumption that health is part of the individual's utility function. Exactly what that means, again, unclear and not something I feel like I have the tools or capacity to take on. But I think that it posits it in a really static way as a sort of, perfect health, which very few people really experience. Many people experience very good health or excellent health, thinking about the short form questions. But people have variable perception of their health. And especially people who have chronic diseases or who have knowledge that they have lost something in terms of their health. I think that how health factors in the utility function may well shift as a result of that. And I think that that's what prospect theory allows, is it could enter health as a good, as a preference, is something that could enter the utility function in different ways and might not be high in the utility function because preference may be low or maybe extremely high. It might be the most valued thing besides life, and whether life and health are different, I don't know. But it allows it to be then anchored to your current health condition. And thinking about loss aversion, the question of, can you lose health, or certainly health status, if health functioning? Yes, you can. And that may really factor into people's decision making in terms of loss aversion. But I also want to say all of this is from the perspective of the individual. And I think all of this could be important for the individual. And most of behavioral economics, from what I know and see in the literature, focuses on the individual. But increasingly, it is being applied to the provider. And this is where I think we really do have to think a little bit differently than we do right now. So the two things I'd like to suggest as economic theories, theoretical positions, propositions that should be considered, both for behavioral economists and for implementation scientists, are first, principal agent theory, and secondly, really taking on more of a cost utility or perhaps disutility approach, thinking about how that factors in. So let me start with principal agent theory. Again, most of you are probably familiar with it, but essentially it posits that when I go to seek healthcare services, I can do some things for myself, of course, but there are many things I can't. I can't write my own prescription. I can't walk into a drugstore and buy my own medications. So I need an agent, and that agent is my provider, my, let's say, primary care provider from other sectors. It could be any kind of provider too, depending on what it is I need and what they are licensed, approved to provide. This reflects, some other economic thinking in labor markets and professional, the whole area of professionalism. The notion that we don't have open markets. We have a lot of gatekeeping and segmented and closed markets where only certain kinds of people are privileged and allowed to do certain kinds of things. And health is full of that. So I think this is one of the issues in thinking about provider-facing work for behavior change, that the provider is generally acting as an agent, not as a principal. This is not their own health that they're taking care of. This is someone else's. And as professionals, clinicians are trained to make that a central thing. First, do no harm. Focus on the person that you're taking care of. Do what you need to do for them as a primary directive and function. And so I think I'm just suggesting that that whole notion of thinking of the agent and their relationship to principles is important. And I also want to point out the patient is not the only principle that the agent provider is acting for. They are also acting for their organization. This is where organizational constraints becomes really critical, that they know what their organization expects through the policies, the procedures, the training, and the social influences around them. And they need to provide services to that organization and do what they do, act in accordance with the expectations of the organization. There are other principles like insurance payers that they are also agents for. I think this is an area that needs more development and more thinking. Very briefly, in terms of cost utility, I think that we often think about, the expected or planned utility of behavior change, the good things that will come out of it once we get through the hurdle of getting the change done. And once we're into this is normal practice. But in that interim, we don't focus much on loss. And I think this is where loss aversion as a theory, as a theoretical proposition really becomes important. And we need to think more about what providers lose when we focus on them as targets of knowledge translation or implementation interventions in our strategies. So very quickly, just to reiterate that this is coming out particularly of the implementation definition that I gave you earlier. This is about thinking through the planning, the fact that this is process, and that this is about behavior change under organizational constraints. So a little bit more about principal agent theory. I think there's always an open question when you're dealing with the idea of a principal and an agent, whose utility might be maximized or satisfied. For whom are you, as somebody who's seeking behavior change, trying to focus on and trying to, in behavioral economic terms, nudge? Whose behavior is it? So it's whose utility first, and then whose behavior is it that needs to change? And the answer is often both. But again, for someone like me who does provider-facing work, it's usually the agent, the provider, not the principal, the patient, that I'm focused on. And I want to say that organizations constrain agents and not necessarily principals. Organizations also constrain principals. I mean, when we go into a clinic as a patient, there are lots of behavioral things we are expected to do and rules we have to follow. But the providers have even more of those, and they're the ones, this is their work and their world. We're just in there temporarily and transiently, we hope. And then this notion of dual agency, I think, is really important. This is well known in the real estate world, where you have a seller's agent who also acts as a buyer's agent. But in healthcare, I would argue we have plenty of dual agency as well. And then I think that it's important to really think about how health psychology applies to the agent versus the principal. And I would argue that health psychology applies to the patient or the principal, not so much to the agent, because it's not their behavior in terms of lifestyle that changes, it's their behavior in terms of their practice. And I would argue that that's a different kind of thing. And on cost utility issues, I think I just enumerated here some of the costs of behavior change that we seldom take a lot of time on or pay attention to, and we don't necessarily quantify them very well. There's an emerging literature in economic evaluation of implementation science, behavioral economics. And I think that we are doing a better job of trying to quantify some of the costs that are fairly easily quantified, like the time it takes to do the interventions, the time it takes to do training in particular, equipment needed, materials, that kind of stuff. But there are many things that are unobservable and therefore much harder to quantify. And learning and unlearning, which is beginning to really enter the discussion on de-implementation, I think is important. Exactly what those terms mean and how we might measure them, I don't know. But I think related to that is loss of self-esteem, which I think is actually a very important concept that we take pay little attention to. In the nursing world, the work of Patricia Benner and her colleagues, a book called From Novice to Expert, has been very influential in terms of how we think about training and education in nursing. And the difference between a novice and an expert in many ways is self-confidence. It's also knowledge, it's also expertise, it's a lot of things, but from a psychological perspective and a sort of cost utility perspective, it is about self-esteem. As an expert, I have a good deal of self-esteem, but when you bump me back from being an expert to being a novice or somewhere in between, I lose some of that. Loss aversion is something to think about, but also just the internal psychic cost. I'll just say, in the middle of revamping my course and doing so with an instructional design firm. And the part that I'm enjoying least is learning that I don't know as much about teaching adults as I think I do. And there is a real cost to that for me that inhibits my interest in doing this and produces a lot of emotional affective reaction that is not necessarily very useful. And then I just want to note, saying that and drawing from that personality may actually be a major factor, which currently we don't measure at all. And again, I don't know about behavioral economics, but I know in implementation science, many people have actually avoided measuring it because it is not modifiable, not easily modifiable, possibly not modifiable at all. And I'm just taking here the big five personality characteristics: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism. And just take openness. You can imagine how openness could affect how you feel about new information coming in. If you're a relatively closed person who gets significant ego strength and takes pride in their expertise, losing that will have bigger consequences than for someone who feels quite open about learning new things. And then I also want to just note that the notion of organizational constraints, agents are also principles in their organizational context. And as healthcare becomes more and more integrated and we have more and more complex organizations, that I think is truer and truer. The notion of workflows is an organizational construct, and they are organizationally designed, maintained, and specified. And I think that as we learn and think about the workflows and the behavior, how to factor behavior change into workflows where no individual is responsible for a whole process. Generally, they have pieces of a process that they need to share with other people, and there are codified ways of doing that that are the workflow. We have to understand that in order to be able to make change. So just very quickly, I'm going to say, in addition to theoretical basis, the other thing that I see is that there are differences in approach. And this is where I think the caricature part probably comes out the most. In implementation science, increasingly we strive for systematic approaches where we use the knowledge that we have obtained, which is codified in what we call frameworks. Very problematic area for us, but especially the frameworks that I use the most, which are called determinants frameworks that codify knowledge about things that become barriers and or facilitators to successive implementation. The testing of specified strategies, and then evaluation, planning, and thinking. What I see in behavioral economics in the books I've read, the papers, and sometimes proposals, is what I would call a pretty radical empiricism. So much more of a, let's try something and see what works. And in Richard Thaler's own books, and books like Inside the Nudge Unit in the UK, they say this explicitly, we're going to try a bunch of things, we're going to try this nudge versus that nudge, and we'll see what works. There's a lot of cost to that, and potentially a lot of waste. It is experimentation. Experimentation is a good thing, but there seems to be little preparatory systematic design thinking. And that to me seems to be a major difference in approach and in the way people think about what they're doing and how they do it. So this is my last slide. What difference does this make? I mean, so I've just spent 30 minutes talking about these things, which I think are interesting, but they may not matter very much. I worry that in this space of how we change the behavior of people who are within complex organizational constraints, we are already, despite the fact that these are newly emerging fields, seeing lots of factionalism, lots of chasms that seem to widen over time between individuals doing this kind of work. And I think that there are key differences that shouldn't be ignored, but I think there may also be more similarities than differences in general. And I think the differences may more be in approach than in the theoretical underpinnings. I think we actually share more of these. And one of the things I would just say is I think there's literature in implementation science that isn't well known in the United States. And that literature is the literature that comes from health psychology. There's something called the behavior change technique taxonomy, which was developed now at least 7-8 years ago in the UK, and published, codified, that are techniques for behavior change. They look a lot like nudges to me. And the question is, start with that catalog of nudges, maybe, instead of just brainstorming nudges. Might be one way in which the two fields could intersect and perhaps collaborate. I don't think ignoring each other is a good idea. I think we can all learn from each other. And I also think that in implementation science, a lot of the historical pressures that have formed the field and continue to form it don't have strong theory bases to them. One of the great strengths of economics is the theoretical basis. And I think that even though people argue with it and there's a lot to discuss, there's a potential for new insights and thinking about the basic principles and mechanisms of the work that we do. So I'm going to stop there, and I'll stop the sharing so that the screen will open up again. And just turn it over to you, Renette.
Thank you so much. We're all giving you applause. This is one of the hardest parts about virtual. We can't give proper thank you to when our guest speakers come. I want to open it up. I have tons of questions, but we have a nice group of folks here that listen to your talk, and I'd like to open it up to folks in the audience.
So I have a torrent of questions, but I'm meeting with Dr. Sales later, so I'm going to control myself. One observation and one question. Hi, that was wonderful, by the way. I love the principal agent theory, and I'm wondering to what extent that explains some of the things that I've seen around the work standardizing handoffs, which you're familiar with in acute care settings, where you have a principal agent, but it's like a principal dual agent, right? So the provider is a principal with respect to themselves and the organization. Mm-hmm. They're an agent with respect to the patient, and they're an agent with respect to the organization. So what's the hierarchy? And what we've seen is that the principal comes first. So even though every provider can say, I care about the patient, the thing that controls their behavior in the moment is workflow, for which they're a principal, because it's their experience. So I think it's very cool. The question I have is totally unrelated. Thinking about personality, which is not changeable, we can respond differently to people's personalities. And so I'm wondering about the use of social marketing sort of tailored to personality, and whether you can use that as an implementation strategy, or even nudges tailored to personality, so that you could imagine a suite of nudges or a suite of whatevers that are meant to hit different people differently.
I think that is the kind of thing that would make sense to me. And I think right now it's a big open area because we really have been ignoring the role of personality and it's kind of treating people like widgets. But in fact, I think those personality traits, and maybe others, that's just sort of the big five, I think could be quite explanatory, even if they're not modifiable, and tailoring to it, absolutely. We can change what we do, even if we're not going to change who they are.
Thanks, Megan, and thanks, Dr. Sales, for that. Sean Snyder.
Hi, so it's more of an upstream kind of question. So what effects would price transparency in healthcare services what effects would there be on providers? Because I'm thinking in the principal agent relationship, like shirking happens when there's information asymmetry. So what do you think about that with price transparency?
Yeah, I think that is a really interesting idea also, and one that I think the whole area of what do the markets really look like, and the pricing part of health services, the goods and services people receive. I'll just say that market is so distorted and so badly disciplined, if that's a good word to use, that there's a lot of work to be done. A lot of organizations can't actually price anything. They don't have the capacity to do that. So I think it's a really promising area, and I would encourage you, if you're interested in that, to pursue it, with a recognition, though, that the cost that you can put on a good or a service is only part of the story. The rest of the story may well be some of the other things that are going on.
Thanks. Pete?
And that was wonderful. I knew it would be wonderful. It's been worth waiting a whole year to have you here. So I'm really trying to ponder all this sort of marriage of these two philosophical realms. And I really am struck by your observations on loss aversion, because I wonder if as you've observed organizations put up barriers and sort of fail to innovate when the data and the evidence is sitting right in front of them, how much, and I realize every situation is different, but how much do you think it is loss aversion on the part of the authority? Like, I don't want to give up the way I'm doing things because I have value ownership. You're making me lose something. Right. By doing something different, even if it's evidence-based and benefits, everybody, including even me. So what do you think?
I think absolutely. I think that starting to factor loss aversion into our expectation of how people might behave could really enrich our thinking about it. Because, when you put it in the organizational context, like you just did, it opens up a whole realm of questions about, how does the organization behave? It is clearly individuals who make those decisions. But, for example, here at the University of Michigan, and I suspect Penn's not that different, big, historical, unwieldy organization where decisions are made in very implicit ways. And I suspect loss aversion is a major piece of how decisions are actually made, because I think, especially when you combine the utilities of various key actors, like the CEO of the health system, and the president of the university, then you get this, sort of amplification of potential loss aversion when people are risk averse and when they're in conditions of huge uncertainty. In a sense, we're watching a grand national experiment playing out, natural and national experiment playing out with COVID, in that organizations, as well as individuals, but mostly organizations, are having to make decisions and having very little time to make those decisions. So they're very pressured. I think there might actually be some information to gain out of it, retrospectively, to see how people made decisions. So I don't think people are aware of their own loss aversion. I can't tell you how much it matters to me to lose something that I have.
Brianna.
Hi, Dr. Sales. Thanks for your presentation. I had a question about something you mentioned, this sort of shift from expert to novice and how that can be psychologically harmful. And you also mentioned that, as health systems get more and more complex, workflows get spread over many hands, where no one person is really responsible for any given task. So I'm wondering sort of like how you see those two concepts fitting in, like how sort of provider responsibility and autonomy could potentially, be psychologically harmful or make them feel like de-skilled or like novices.
Yeah, I think all of those potentially could, create the depth or extent of harm that people perceive. And I think you could almost say it probably relates to the hierarchy in healthcare, you know, the bigger they come, the harder they fall kind of thing. But I also think that the other thing that's important about this can be quite transient. So this notion of loss, it depends on how quickly you can regain expertise, because I don't want to posit this as like a permanent loss. For most people, it's not. It's temporary, but that length of the time, that how temporary is it, how long does it last with respect to the change period, the window of time in which the change is happening, may be actually quite important. I'll just say there's a notion of something called the negative opinion leader, which is, you know, sort of the leader of the opposition to the resistance to change. And I think that this concept could be a big piece of who those negative opinion leaders are, why they have become the leaders of the resistance instead of the champions of change, and how you might be able to convert them. Because if you can focus on negative opinion leaders in a change process situation and flip them, they often become big champions. And because they were negative before, the fact that they changed their opinion can be very influential. So I think there's a lot of stuff here that can be unpacked and thought about, very specific to specific change situations and operations.
It looks like Jeffrey and Charlie both have further comments on loss aversion. Jeffrey, would you like to go next?
Sure. I was, very interested in your loss aversion analysis, but at the same time, so many concepts emphasize teamwork, like in nursing, teamwork. But does teamwork sometimes involve loss aversion? You're losing your autonomy. How does that work?
I think that's a really good question. I'll just say, yeah, so as a nurse, I think I can say this, although my nursing colleagues can tell whether it was okay or not. Nurses are often very angry people. And they spend their workday often balancing their sense of duty and interest, their expertise, their professionalism, with a sort of a simmering sense of, I'm only doing this because I have to, kind of thing. Now, I'm overstating it, but, worked as a nurse, I've experienced it a lot. I've experienced it personally, and I've seen other people experience it. And I suspect that's exactly your point, that they are losing some of their own autonomy and their decision-making about how I would do things by being in a team, and especially a very hierarchically formed team sometimes, not always. And I think that may well explain a lot of behavior, and also potential for mitigating some of those behaviors if we can reconfigure teams or design them, perhaps get people on board in different ways. I think that's a really interesting point.
Okay, thanks.
Charlie, did you want to follow up?
Yes, thank you. So I'm a novice de-implementation scientist, I think. I work in a critical care setting, and I think, like many of the people listening to you, I'm really, really struck by this idea of loss aversion. In some ways, it's literally like the loss of a patient if you don't send the right test or start the right treatment, right? But also, I think I'm thinking a little bit about loss aversion in terms of the sense of a safety net that we feel if we have done everything and sent everything we're supposed to send to take care of a critically ill patient, and risk and uncertainty obviously is a huge part of that. So I guess I'm just excited by that idea, I guess, and I'm just wondering, would you tackle those two things in different ways, right? The loss of being worried about loss aversion for the patient in front of you, and loss aversion for yourself in terms of the protection you feel by the actions you've taken.
I think both of those make a lot of sense. And I think this is one of the things that differentiates critical care, for example, from primary care. The chances that a patient will die in front of you in primary care are really vanishingly small. It does happen sometimes, very rarely. The chances of that happening in critical care, pretty high. And I think people buffer themselves. There's all kinds of other stuff happening. But I think that your point that if you feel like you have done all the things you could have done is a really different thing from knowing that you could have maybe done something else that would have mitigated, changed, or averted that loss. And I think death is, because it is completely irrevocable to our knowledge, it's sort of like it is a huge major issue for people that sort of permeates the environment when it's a frequent occurrence. So I think you're right. And I think that maybe if we think about how the different settings, contexts, and sort of acuity expectations of major things like death or major harm are different across those settings, it could have some impact on how we think about what's useful and what isn't.
Thank you.
I'm gonna ask a question that kind of tunnels us out a little bit from loss aversion specifically. Yeah. It looks like there's a few more comments in the chat if you want to take a look, Anne. Sure. I want to pick up on something you said related to kind of the way that implementation science has grown in different countries and the alignment, because actually I often get feedback on manuscripts like, this is very US centric, the way you've presented Eric's strategies as being like the, the core set of strategies. And it's really made me realize that I have a gap in my knowledge and kind of knowing what's happening in other countries and other spaces. And I'm curious, and I know that you were, an associate editor of implementation science before becoming editor of implementation science communications. I know that's a very global editorial group. How do we bring everything together? Because it feels like these factions are problematic.
Yeah, I think they absolutely are. And I think, this has been something that has been talked about, discussed. I think we need some organizing infrastructure that allows us to interact with each other readily. Right now, we don't. I mean, we interact through papers, we interact through the occasional conferences. I mean, folks from other countries are coming to the NIH-sponsored D&I conference in December more often. This last year, interestingly, lots of people from around the globe came because it was virtual. And, and that's part of it also, that, if we make it more accessible, then I think the more we'll have. But I think there also are other issues. It's not just how easy it is for people. I think that there are core issues around how the systems are configured in different countries. So when I was in Canada, one of the questions I got asked by a Canadian researcher was, why is the US not buying into some of these principles and not, at that point, implementation science was really nascent in the US, whereas it had been going on in Canada for some time. And I thought about it, he thought about it, and we both agreed that the US, with its fee-for-service system and non-integrated systems, not that the Canadian systems are integrated, they're not, but that reality of how fragmented our systems are and how the incentives are so channeled towards individual fees, payment for services rendered, no sense of sort of global capitation, none of the things that you get when you have the Canadian Health Act and the National Health Service in the UK of social contracting and the society-wide expectation around health services and what they offer. I think all of that mitigates into this sort of, the US is different, and Canada is more like, in some ways, the UK and Australia than it is like the US, even though it's very like the US. I mean, other than payment, the Canadian system looks a lot like our system. In subtle ways, it's not. But so I think all of those things matter, and how to think about them and talk about them, I think is really, I just think we need to be doing more attempts to do that.
Other questions? We have 3 minutes before I hand it over to Rachel. So I certainly have more, but want to give others the opportunity to ask.
I have a question about equity.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about going back to the dual agent idea, which I'm having a lot of fun with. Do you know if there's anything that's looked at the extent to which an agent might identify with the principal,
Right.
and whether that determines how they prioritize. And I'm sort of thinking about, if you have racial concordance, for instance, with a patient, are you more
Yep.
likely to go to bat for them against the organization? Whereas if you don't, then you identify more with the organization. You see
Yeah,
where I'm going?
absolutely. And I think the notion of the bias, this is where the other part of prospect theory with biases and heuristics really kicks in. That, if you have sort of anywhere in your brain the idea that somebody who is so different from you in terms of skin color, social class, presentation, any of that kind of stuff, will not want the same things that you want, then as an agent, you're likely not to be able to identify what their wants and needs are if you don't believe that you can. And so I actually think thinking about intersecting those pieces and how that might function may be very important. I also just think, I think loss aversion is very culturally contextualized and developed. And so another thought is, are there differences between how the principal thinks about loss aversion and what is lost to them versus what is lost to the agent? And if the agent is putting their assumptions and beliefs onto the principal inappropriately or incorrectly, that could easily lead to a serious disconnect and potential harm.
And this is really a great talk. And I just wanted to build off something that Renad said earlier, where we have these global factions that how do we sort of cross those differences, but also acknowledge that there are fundamental differences. It feels to me like there's also some fundamental differences in the different disciplines that implementation science touches. And I'm thinking in particular public health, the mental health, and then the other clinical healthcare delivery models. And I'm wondering whether we need to just accept them as having these fundamental differences, or are there ways that we really should be trying to pull them together? I mean, should we lump, should we split? Is it really a piece of both? And how do you think about that?
I think the most important thing is to catalog the differences and understand them. And I think that, before we can figure out whether there's lumping or splitting and how to sort of manage them, just understanding what they are. I mean, as I was thinking again, Renat, in response to your question, part of the issue is that the health systems we live in and work in are kind of like the air we breathe. We honestly, unless you make an effort to find out what happens differently in some other place, move there, something, you don't realize how different things are. And that makes it very hard if it's just assumed context without much knowledge of how it's shaped and formed. Then I think it's really hard to even begin to think about what those differences mean.
Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Rachel. This was an amazing talk. Another round of applause. We're so thrilled that you were here.
Thank you. And I'll just add to Renat's thanks to you for joining us today. It was really wonderful to have you. And I just also want to take a minute before everyone disappears to remind you that we have an upcoming seminar next week on addressing the social needs to improve health. That's going to return to what has been our more traditional panel type seminar over the past year. But the research seminars are not going away. And next month, we are having Otube Essien join us for the next research seminar. So stay tuned, and I hope everyone will join us again next time. Thanks, and thanks, Renat.
Thank you very much. This has been fun.